It can be what you want it to be. There are no rules. There are rules that can be broken. Heavy metal is just heavy metal. Proud that we're a heavy metal band.
In the world of heavy metal, where everything is pushed to the extreme, from sound to imagery, from personalities to scandals, Glenn Tipton emerged as a paradox. He wasn't the one screaming on stage, smashing guitars to pieces, or making shocking headlines. He stood there quietly, solemnly, always a step behind the spotlight. And yet, from that very silence, he created riffs more destructive than 1,000 screams, leaving a deeper imprint than anyone who ever shouted their own name in metal history. As lead guitarist and the creative soul behind Judas Priest, Glenn Tipton helped shape one of the most powerful and relentless currents in 20th century rock, British heavy metal. His music didn't need to be flamboyant to be dangerous. It was the cold snarl of metal forged in darkness, the unrelenting speed of Painkiller, the haunting agony of Beyond the Realms of Death. Songs that brought an entire generation of headbangers to their knees, only to rise again in unison. Yet when the lights went off and the cameras stopped rolling, Glenn Tipton vanished as if he'd never been there. No scandals, no statements, no self-pity. And then in 2018, when he announced his retirement from touring due to Parkinson's disease, fans were stunned to learn he had been fighting the illness in silence for over a decade, still performing, still composing, still living fully without ever asking for sympathy. Some people live to be seen. Glenn Tipton lived to be heard, and left behind an echo that never fades. In a noisy world, he remains the quietest whisper that carries the farthest. Early life. Glenn Raymond Tipton was born on October 25, 1947, in Blackheath, a working-class town nestled in the industrial heart of the West Midlands, where the sky was often dulled by coal dust and steel smoke. In that world, music wasn't a luxury. It was virtually non-existent. The only place metal rang out was inside the factories, and joy came only in fleeting moments between labor shifts. His father died when he was still a child. His mother, a tough, quiet woman, raised him alone, clinging to a fragile sense of stability in a post-war Britain on the brink of collapse. Glenn didn't grow up surrounded by classical records or a piano in the living room. He grew up with the sounds of hammers, lathes, and the wind cutting through iron window frames. That was how his ear for sound was forged. Not romantic, not academic, but raw, practical, and haunting. His teenage years were marked by technical school and shifts at a local steel plant. Spending entire days beside heavy slabs of metal, he absorbed a wordless discipline, endurance, precision, and zero tolerance for error. It was a mindset he later brought into his guitar playing. Every riff, like the pulse of a hydraulic press, every solo, a blade slicing through silence. He didn't find music through a bright, glorious dream, but rather as the only escape from the suffocating quiet of everyday life. His first guitar came from his brother Gary, an amateur musician, and the only one in the family who recognized the faint spark in Glenn. There were no teachers, no conservatories, no studios. Just a young man, self-taught in a cramped room, calloused fingers from steel, still pressing on, string by string. In a place where no one taught you how to dream, Glenn lit his own spark in silence. And that silence would later become the most precious ingredient in his music. No need to say much, just play and let others feel the rest. Early career. In his 20s, Glenn Tipton was still just a factory worker in Birmingham's steel mills, wearing protective gear every day, wielding wrenches amid the roar of machines and thick smoke. Yet after each shift, he quietly embraced his guitar as his only escape. At first, it was just nights spent wandering through small-time bands like Merlin or Shave 'Em Dry, covering Cream, Hendrix, and Led Zeppelin in smoke-filled pubs. It wasn't until the formation of Flying Hat Band, a progressive rock group with big ambitions, that Glenn truly had the chance to write music of his own. The band even signed with Vertigo Records and was chosen to open for Deep Purple, but before their debut album could be released, they broke up. What remained for Glenn was a deep sense of disappointment and a haunting question. Would he resign himself to an anonymous life on the factory floor or continue gambling everything on music? The answer came in 1974, when Judas Priest, a young band from the same city, asked him to join in time to record their first album, Rock-a-Rolla. Glenn accepted, not because he foresaw fame, but because he recognized this was the only group daring to pursue a sound heavier, darker, and fiercer than anyone else around. Yet Rock-a-Rolla turned into a bitter disappointment. Under the producer's control, the album leaned heavily into psychedelic and blues rock, leaving Judas Priest unable to show their true identity. Behind the scenes, Glenn was the one who firmly pushed back, insisting the band must break free of blues influences and fully embrace a sound of pure metal. That break came with Sad Wings of Destiny in 1976, a genuine turning point. For the first time, Glenn and K.K. Downing collaborated as equals in songwriting, creating the twin guitar model, two guitars leading in harmony and opposition, like dual engines driving a single machine. In Victim of Changes, Glenn carved out razor-sharp, jagged riffs for Rob Halford's screams to cut through the audience. In Tyrant and Genocide, his guitar struck like hammer blows, harsh yet surgically precise. And in Dreamer Deceiver, he revealed another side, his ability to weave soft, drawn-out melodies that conjured a brooding atmosphere and opened the album to a dark, almost mystical dimension. With Sad Wings of Destiny, Judas Priest laid the foundation of heavy metal, and Glenn Tipton proved he was more than just a guitarist. He was a riff engineer, the quiet architect behind an entire genre's identity. The years that followed were still a struggle, with the band surviving on cheap tours, riding in battered vans, crashing on friends' floors, and subsisting on cold bread. But it was on those small stages that Glenn honed his trademark presence. No showmanship, no meaningless complexity, just every note struck like a steel blade, cold, sharp, and unmistakable. With Sin After Sin, 1977, and Stained Class, 1978, Glenn solidified his central role in Judas Priest. Sinner unveiled an aggression unheard of before. Exciter stormed ahead with breakneck speed that prefigured thrash metal, while Beyond the Realms of Death was hailed as a model metal ballad with its intricate structure and haunting melody. By the late 1970s, Judas Priest had yet to find commercial stardom, but those early years forged the raw block of steel that would define them. Glenn Tipton had gone from an anonymous factory worker to the man who engineered a new sound for an entire generation. And when his icy guitar rang out on Sad Wings of Destiny or Stained Class, heavy metal was no longer an experiment. It was a declaration. Career success. Entering the 1980s, when punk and disco were dominating the charts, Judas Priest remained loyal to a sound dismissed as too dry, too heavy, and too harsh to ever sell. Yet in this seemingly unfavorable climate, Glenn Tipton quietly wrote the riffs that would change history. In 1980, British Steel was released, marking the turning point that lifted Judas Priest out of the shadows and into the international spotlight. With Breaking the Law, Glenn created a riff that was short, sharp, instantly singable, but carried the force of an entire working-class generation hungry for rebellion. Living After Midnight was freer, more optimistic, a declaration of youth living life to the fullest. It was Glenn who shaped this tempered steel sound, lean, concise, stripped of excess, but driven deep into the listener's body. 2 years later, Judas Priest returned with Screaming for Vengeance, 1982, the album that elevated them to superstardom. Glenn made a powerful impression with Electric Eye, which opened with guitar lines like twisted metal, industrial, eerie, and explosive, like a distorted prophecy. On the same record, You've Got Another Thing Comin' became Judas Priest's biggest hit in the US, proving that heavy metal could dominate both radio and stadiums. Glenn's style in this era was no longer that of a guitarist standing in the background, but that of an icon. He never flaunted technique for its own sake, but every solo he played carried a cold, mathematical precision that left audiences breathless. Success continued with Defenders of the Faith, 1984, where Glenn and K.K. Downing pushed the twin guitar attack to new extremes. Tracks like Freewheel Burning and The Sentinel were relentless, ferocious, showcasing speed and power few had ever dared attempt. But in 1986, Turbo shocked fans when Judas Priest introduced synths and electronic guitar textures. Glenn had a hand in driving this experiment, yet the album drew harsh criticism for being too commercial. Behind the scenes, divisions began to surface. Glenn and K.K. sought new directions, while fans demanded the pure steel of old. Judas Priest entered a period of tension. Only 2 years later, Ram It Down, 1988, restored the needed aggression and paved the way for the ultimate explosion. Painkiller, 1990. From the opening riff of the title track, Glenn seemed to hammer the world of metal into submission. Blistering riffs, breakneck tempos, and solos like storms of fire, making Painkiller one of the greatest heavy metal songs ever recorded. The album itself confirmed that Judas Priest, even after nearly 20 years, had lost none of their power and had instead become the living definition of heavy metal, a standard generations to come would measure themselves against. On the Painkiller tour, Glenn stood at the center, steel hands, a cold gaze, and solos that seemed to slice the air in half. But bright lights came with Turmoil. When Rob Halford left the band in the early 1990s, Judas Priest had to find a new voice. Through this turbulent period, Glenn became one of the pillars keeping the band alive. He led Judas Priest through the difficult years with Ripper Owens, releasing Jugulator, 1997, and Demolition, 2001, albums with modern flavors, groove, thrash, but unable to recapture past glory. Behind the scenes, Glenn was constantly balancing between preserving their golden legacy and meeting the pressures of reinvention, between fan expectations and the weariness of bandmates, especially as his relationship with K.K. Downing grew increasingly distant in creative vision. The turning point came in 2003 when Rob Halford returned. Glenn was one of the strongest voices supporting this reunion, because more than anyone, he knew Judas Priest was only whole when Halford's screams soared over his steel riffs. The result was Angel of Retribution, 2005, an album fans hailed as a miraculous rebirth. Songs like Judas Rising and Hellrider proved that Glenn's songwriting power was still intact after more than 3 decades, blending classic fire with modern force. The world tour that followed Angel of Retribution stood as proof that Judas Priest had never died, only waited for the moment to erupt again. But challenges persisted. With Nostradamus, 2008, Glenn and the band attempted a 2-disc concept album chronicling the life of the French prophet. This was Glenn's passion project, intended to prove that heavy metal could be symphonic, grand, and dramatic on the scale of an opera. The reception was divided. Some praised its boldness, others dismissed it as overlong and diluted. Still, Nostradamus showed Glenn's refusal to repeat himself, his restless hunger for experimentation, even as age bore down. After K.K. Downing's departure in 2011, the burden on Glenn's shoulders grew heavier. He became the true leader in the studio, working with Richie Faulkner to reshape Judas Priest through Redeemer of Souls, 2014. Though not hailed as a classic on the level of Painkiller or Screaming for Vengeance, fans recognized it as a statement of survival that Judas Priest was still alive and fighting. On stage, Glenn, well into his 60s, stood alongside Faulkner, transforming the twin guitar dynamic into a dialogue between past and present. The peak of this late chapter was Firepower, 2018. Glenn co-wrote and co-produced the album, which critics and fans alike called the strongest Judas Priest release in decades. Tracks like Lightning Strike and Necromancer carried modern energy, yet held fast to the band's old steel spirit. What made Firepower extraordinary was the context. By then, Glenn had gone public with his battle against Parkinson's disease. The hands that had forged legendary riffs were losing their precision, but he insisted on recording many guitar parts himself. When the band launched the Firepower tour, Glenn appeared only for a handful of songs before stepping back, handing the stage to Andy Sneap. For fans, the sight of Glenn walking out, trembling but resolutely gripping his guitar to play Metal Gods, was the most poignant moment of his career. A farewell forged in fire. Looking back, from British Steel opening the gates to the world, to Painkiller defining the peak of heavy metal, to Angel of Retribution resurrecting the band, and Firepower closing with one last blaze, Glenn Tipton's career success was never just about a guitarist's journey. It was the story of a steelworker who took the sound of the factory and turned it into music that roared across the globe, keeping it alive until his body could no longer obey. He stands as living proof that heavy metal is not a trend, but a belief forged in blood, sweat, and trembling yet unyielding hands. Solo career. After more than 2 decades in the spotlight with Judas Priest, Glenn Tipton decided to try a path of his own. Inside him, there had always been melodies and ideas that didn't quite fit the metal mold of the band, and they had remained tucked away in drawers for years. It wasn't until the late 1990s, when Judas Priest was struggling with new vocalist Ripper Owens, that Glenn found the space to step out with something truly personal. In 1997, he released his first solo album, Baptism of Fire. This was a project Glenn built with his own hands, bringing together renowned musicians like Cozy Powell, Rainbow, Billy Sheehan, Mr. Big, and Robert Trujillo, Suicidal Tendencies, later of Metallica. The music on Baptism of Fire was strikingly different, infused with elements of thrash, speed, and even progressive metal. It felt like Glenn was breaking free from the strict framework of Judas Priest to experiment with speed, complexity, and darker shades of sound. Tracks like Hardcore, Paint It Black, a cover of the Rolling Stones, and Enter the Storm revealed Glenn as both fierce and contemplative, not just a craftsman of riffs, but an artist, with something deeply personal to say. Though the album did not achieve commercial success, it proved that Glenn was not confined to Judas Priest. He was capable of building an entirely different world on his own. He didn't stop there. Glenn later revisited unreleased recordings from the 1980s and early 1990s, compiling them into the album Edge of the World, 2006. This work carried a unique weight. It was tied to two departed friends, John Entwistle of The Who and Cozy Powell. The three had once recorded tracks for a side project that was never released during their lifetimes. With Edge of the World, Glenn sent a letter back to the past, both as a tribute and as a way of preserving the voices of his old companions. The music here was heavier with reflection, more introspective, showing a Glenn Tipton who had lived through both glory and bitterness, now playing as if in conversation with himself. What stood out in both albums was Glenn's process. He often began writing on a keyboard before translating the music to guitar. This habit gave the songs a melodic, layered quality, distinct from the cold steel style Judas Priest was known for. Many fans listening to Baptism of Fire were surprised to discover a Glenn Tipton who was no longer icy and distant, but bold, diverse, even wild. After Edge of the World, Glenn released no further solo albums. Partly, Judas Priest had reunited with Rob Halford and the schedule grew relentless. Partly, his health was beginning to decline. Instead, he poured what energy remained back into Judas Priest, contributing to Firepower, 2018, the last album stamped with Glenn Tipton's mark, recorded even as Parkinson's disease was beginning to steal precision from his hands. Glenn Tipton's solo career was not long, limited to 2 albums and a handful of unfinished projects. Yet it revealed a different man behind Judas Priest's cold, calculated guitarist, an artist hungry for freedom, eager to experiment, and willing to step beyond his comfort zone to find his own voice. Those songs, though rarely mentioned, remain like a secret diary, pages where Glenn poured everything he could not express in Judas Priest's roar. And in them, listeners found a Glenn Tipton who was more layered, lonelier, but also the most truthful version of himself. Turmoil and Shadows. Glenn Tipton was never a man of many words, but his silence was not born of having nothing to say. It was because if he spoke, it might consume him. In 2008, at the age of 60, Glenn was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, a slowly progressing neurological disorder that attacked the very place where he had survived for more than 30 years. His hands, his fingers, the absolute control of the smallest movements. Only his family and a few close bandmates knew. For nearly a decade, he kept touring, kept recording, kept stepping on stage as if nothing had changed. But every bend of a string, every press of a fret became a silent battle between an artist and the body betraying him. He never asked for pity. In his brief statement announcing his withdrawal from the Firepower tour in 2018, Glenn simply said, "I'm still me. I just can't play everything like I used to." Only then did the world realize he had been fighting in silence for 10 years. No complaints, no tears, not a single display of weakness on stage. It was not the silence of surrender, but the ruthless strength of a man who refused to let the public see him fall. Yet the darkness in Glenn's life was not only illness. When K.K. Downing left Judas Priest in 2011, the fracture between them was laid bare. In his memoir, Heavy Duty, Downing accused Glenn of being manipulative, controlling every aspect of the band, and indirectly forcing him out. They were bitter words after 3 decades of standing side by side. Glenn chose silence. No rebuttals, no explanations, no interviews to reclaim his image, but those who were close understood. The distance between them was never healed, and Judas Priest moved forward as if Downing had never been there. Glenn bore the blame, and as always, he chose to endure rather than argue. Another shadow fell when Firepower was released. The album was showered with praise, but whispers spread through the metal community. Had Glenn really played all his guitar parts? Or had Andy Sneap, the co-producer, replaced many of them in the studio? The band denied it. Sneap deflected. Glenn, as usual, stayed silent. For a man who had spent his life forging every note with steel hands, being doubted may have hurt more than the disease destroying his body. Yet he offered no explanations. He did not live to justify himself. He simply played, until he no longer could. Glenn left behind no confessions, no quarrels, and no demand for final applause. What he left instead was something else, a cut, invisible, but deep into the soul of a generation. His silence, it turned out, echoed louder than any scream. Personal life. For over 40 years, Glenn Tipton stood on thousands of stages, played before millions, and wrote epic anthems forged in steel and sound. But when the lights went out, he quietly slipped away. No parties, no post-show interviews, no all-night drinking sessions like many of his peers. Glenn, almost as if vanishing from the world, left only the lingering echo of his guitar on an empty stage. There is a truth that still astonishes longtime fans. Glenn Tipton left virtually no trace beyond his music. No one really knows where he lives. No one has seen photos of a wife or children. No interview ever mentioned his family life, his beliefs, or his politics, things that nearly every veteran artist has shared at one point or another. He is a living enigma and has chosen to stay that way. The one person the public has seen him consistently connected to is Rob Halford. The bond between Glenn and Halford needs no words. Unlike loud, camera-ready friendships, they rarely embraced on stage. But Halford once choked up speaking about Glenn during a show in Sweden. Every time we play Painkiller without Glenn, it feels like part of the band's soul is missing. That's the kind of friendship born from years of relentless touring, sleeping on cold floors, writing riffs in hotel hallways, and facing thousands of fans while quietly battling things no one ever knew. Off stage, Glenn chose a life without sound. He lives in the English countryside, spending time gardening, reading, and recording in a small home studio. Friends describe him as unfailingly polite, concise, and almost painfully honest. A classic gentleman in a world of wild rockers. When Glenn founded the Glenn Tipton Parkinson's Foundation, dedicated to research and treatment, he didn't hold a grand press conference. He simply sold the guitar he had played for nearly 3 decades. When asked why he didn't auction it off with a signed photo or promotional fanfare, he replied, "I want the buyer to play it, not hang it on a wall. It was made to make noise." For Glenn Tipton, everything has a purpose. His silence wasn't coldness. It was belief that real life doesn't lie in what's told, but in how you live when no one is watching. In a world where artists increasingly resemble public personas, Glenn Tipton chose to be the man walking just behind the spotlight, between two realms, stage and stillness. And sometimes it's that very quiet that makes someone greater than all the noise. Legacy and influence. Glenn Tipton never asked anyone to follow his path. He didn't write guitar handbooks, didn't host master classes, didn't take on students, didn't go on inspiration tours. But it was precisely this silence that made him an unrepeatable archetype, not just in music, but in the way an artist can exist quietly in an increasingly noisy and self-centered world. Through dozens of albums with Judas Priest, Glenn's music has left an indelible imprint on the DNA of global metal. From the razor-sharp riff of Metal Gods, to the unhinged velocity of Painkiller, to the cold, logical structure of the Sentinel, each carries his trademark technical incision. Not flashy like Eddie Van Halen, not shimmering like Randy Rhoads, not mystical like Tony Iommi. Glenn Tipton carved out his own school of sound, steely, precise, and uncompromising. Younger guitarists, from Dimebag Darrell, Pantera, Alex Skolnick, Testament, to Dave Murray, Iron Maiden, have all acknowledged learning from Glenn, not just how to play, but how to channel fury, how to let sound speak instead of words. In a metal world that often glorifies excess, Glenn chose restraint, and that restraint turned every riff he wrote into a kind of incantation that players longed to decode. Though he was never the face of Judas Priest, Glenn was the architect behind the structure of its most essential albums. When Rob Halford stepped away in the 1990s, it was Glenn who kept the band from falling apart. When the group experimented with new sounds on Turbo or Demolition, it was Glenn who ensured Priest didn't lose its core. And when the band returned with firepower at age 70, Glenn, while battling Parkinson's, was still co-producer, musical advisor, and the soul behind the project. Yet Glenn Tipton's greatest legacy doesn't lie on any record. It lies in how he chose to live. In an industry obsessed with personality, he stepped back. Among artists chasing accolades, he never won a solo award. No personal Grammy, no Rock Hall induction, no medals. And when his body could no longer match his hands, he never made the audience witness his decline. He withdrew. No tears, no goodbyes. Some might call that silence. But for Glenn Tipton, it was dignity. Today, when people look back on what metal used to be, they recall the spotlight, Halford's scream, Ozzy's painted face, Dave Mustaine's wild mane. But then they pause and remember a man in sunglasses standing by his amp, barely moving, saying nothing, letting his sound say everything. That was Glenn Tipton, a guitarist who dared to be silent in a world of noise. And because of that, he's never been forgotten. Life today. No more nights ablaze with stage lights. No more blistering solos that send crowds into a frenzy. Now in his 70s, Glenn Tipton no longer needs a sword because the warrior in him has fought his final battle and won by remaining wholly himself to the very end. After stepping down from the Firepower Tour in 2018 as Parkinson's advanced, Glenn all but disappeared from public view. No press conferences, no award speeches, no social media updates. But somewhere behind the curtain he still lingers, a silent presence just out of sight. At special shows, particularly in London or his hometown Birmingham, fans still fall silent when Glenn appears during the encore. His movements slower, his hands more unsteady. But when the guitar is strapped across his shoulder, the entire venue holds its breath. Then, with just one familiar riff, the audience erupts. Not for the precision, but for the fact that he's still there. Even as his hands tremble, his gaze remains calm. Glenn lives in a quiet, rural part of England, spending his days gardening, caring for a few pets, and working on unreleased demos. Some say he still plays each morning, even if only for a few minutes. Not to maintain skill, but to hold on to himself. He continues to stand by Judas Priest as an artistic and spiritual advisor, particularly during recent studio demos. Though he no longer performs in full, Glenn is always the final pair of ears before the band makes any musical decision. When the group was nominated for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Glenn declined to appear in person, but sent a voice message so brief it left listeners speechless. In recent years, the one endeavor he's maintained is the Glenn Tipton Parkinson's Foundation. There are no loud fundraising campaigns. He simply sells his guitars, the only possessions he's ever truly bonded with, to raise funds for others with the disease. He never wanted to be seen as a victim, only as someone who could do one small thing, and do it with integrity. Glenn Tipton hasn't written a memoir. He hasn't starred in a biopic. He doesn't appear on talk shows to relive his past. And perhaps that's exactly why he retains what so few artists still possess: dignity, stillness, and a sound that cannot be replaced. What do you think? In a world where everyone rushes to prove they still exist, is there anything braver than disappearing with grace, like Glenn Tipton? Share your thoughts about him in the comments. And if you've ever heard a riff that made your heart skip a beat, maybe, just maybe, it was his. Some artists blaze through this world like fire, fierce, consuming, then gone in a flash of light. But others are like metal, cold, quiet, enduring, never needing to be seen to be known they are there. Glenn Tipton is one of those. He doesn't need to be called a legend, doesn't need charts, awards, or ceremonial handshakes. What he leaves behind isn't a personal brand, but an invisible legacy, a sound that cannot be imitated, a life philosophy that needs no explanation, and a rare kind of kindness in a world that demands you scream just to be heard. Glenn never said much, but if you've ever heard Painkiller rip through the night, if you've gone still during the solo in Beyond the Realms of Death, or felt your throat tighten seeing him emerge from the shadows, guitar trembling in hand, then you understand. Some people remain silent their entire lives just to say, once, what no one else dares admit. Through music, through resilience, through the way they lived. And what about you? In a world growing louder and more frantic by the day, is a silence like Glenn Tipton's, resolute, enduring, and painfully honest, still a legacy worth holding on to? Leave a comment below. And if this story moved you, consider leaving a like, or simply a quiet thank you for the man who chose to play to the very end, then stepped away, never asking to be pitied.